Welcome to Talent Talks, brought to you by the 4As and 4As Foundation, where we shine a spotlight on leaders who are actively demonstrating ways to create inclusive and equitable workplaces. I'm Cathy Butler, EVP of Talent, Equity, and Learning Solutions. On today's episode, I'm so excited to speak with Graham Nolan, co-founder of Do the WeRQ. He is also a consultant in reputation management, communications, and public relations. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Let's start off with your background and how and what inspired you to co-found Do the WeRQ.
Yeah, so my background is so I'm from Ohio, and I went to college at Ohio University and studied at journalism school there. And it was really funny. I studied what was it, advertising management broadly, and then I got a job at an agency. I got a job at Leo Burnett in Chicago, and they're just like, "You're on corporate communications," and I was like, "What is that?" But of course, I took it. It was funny. I got into the industry on what I thought was the worst interview I ever gave. So there's hope for everyone. And and all of a sudden I was like PR for agencies, which is something that like struck me as like, oh wow, I guess we do need this, right? But my education was really, for like the late 90s, early 2000s was very like, look, it's just a matter of like integration and telling the right story in the right place. So that helped me actually with PR. And that helped me like advance in this field. And then it gave me like a nice, I go back that far in the story because it gave me a nice like, okay, like if I have the basics and I fortify them, then you can apply them in different directions and you can learn. Which takes me to I have a 23-year-old career in advertising, in reputation management for agencies and for communications and for PR. And then we get to around, what is it, like 2016, and I'm working actually a little earlier, even working at agencies where the DEI conversation is changing. And so it used to be like in the Audis that you can just sort of like put out a statement that just sort of say we have equal hiring practices, and everyone's like, well, they're clearly not discriminatory. And that was, for a decade that sort of took care of it. And by the time we get to the 2010s, it's like, we're starting to have the real conversations about accountability. And a PR person is in position of being asked, like, can we say this about diversity? Can we say this about what we believe? And a lot of times, because I had good leadership teams I was working with on those discussions, it's like, no, you can't necessarily say that. Like, you have to have commitment, you have to do something. And so they would be like, well, what can we do to start, to being able to say the things that we wanted to say? So my path into anything DEI related was, a company's wanting to say something and understanding that they should probably commit to action. And because, I had this broad range of skills in terms of marketing, I knew how to do experiential, I knew how to do digital, I knew how to write. A lot of the time when they were comfortable, they would say, well, what's your idea on what we can do to fulfill this promise? And so I started dipping my toe into like DEI programs and helping support the teams on those. In 2019, in the fall, I decided that I'd lived in New York for 9 years. I thought it would be neat if I could look out a window and see a tree that wasn't embedded in a small piece of sidewalk. So I decided to move to Austin, Texas, and I was unemployed for 4 months. And I wanted to get into, more into the DEI space. I was really inspired by the 3% movement and what they've done for women in the industry and ad color and what they've done for people of color in the industry. And in fact, when we were talking about the founding of Do the WeRQ, those are the first like two organizations that we called. So they've been instrumental to providing us with vision and inspiration. And it just turned into it was really funny just like talking to every LGBTQ person I could while I was eating breakfast tacos in Austin, and all of them saying, wait, you don't have to start this organization. We have this." And I'm like, do we? And there was like a lot of people who were like, oh, of course we have a queer organization in advertising. Like, this is such a supportive industry. Like, it's creative, it's pop cultural. Like, of course there's a place for us. And then you had other people who are like, of course we have an organization like this in Adland because, we have real problems and there's all these challenges that face us and we have discrimination. So of course there's this organization. So you'd say, okay, cool. What is it? I want to join it. And then they'd go, oh shit, we don't have it. It was just like a revelation for everyone. And then I eventually met Kate Wolf, who's the co-chair and co-founder of Do the WeRQ, who runs Lupine Creative out in Los Angeles. And then we decided, let's start something. We realized that it was going to be scale that sort of was what we would provide in terms of community because we saw this will tie very heavily into the partnerships we've done. We saw that all of the excellence in terms of progress was being done with like a campaign here or a campaign there, and also with ERGs. Some of them were like more established than others, and employee resource groups were making things happen. But it's like if this person had this person's resource, and if this person, when they left their agency, was still able to connect to something, we just knew that there was, purpose to providing a larger community. So, Do the Work is now the first, as we understand, LGBTQ community for advertising professionals and marketing professionals in the U.S.
That is amazing. And I love your background so much. And I think it resonates with so many folks of being in a place where you have ideas and you have expertise and you want questions answered. And so much of that propels action and
Yes.
propels ways to support passion and advocacy that in some ways you didn't know you had inside of you, but clearly something is resonating. And I love the founding of Do the Work in the questions around, well, of course there is a community. I too thought there was a community until you and I connected. And I was like, oh, wait, there wasn't a community until you created it. So tell
Yeah.
us more about the mission and the platform.
So the mission is to elevate LGBTQ plus creativity, representation, and share a voice in the advertising and marketing industry. Um, I always sort of take it for people who are unfamiliar with the organization to a place of where everyone sees the tension in the world. A common refrain in this conversation will probably be, because it is in most of my conversations, that problems are a good thing to recognize. So in our industry, I would go to many a conference. So I'm a PR person. I'm going and putting people on stage, and I'm watching all the diversity discussions that I can. And you see, they usually talk about queer issues in advertising. Over the last couple decades, it would come up because it was Pride or because someone messed up. There was a campaign, it was off, the casting was weird. Clearly, the nuance of like their understanding of culture, they'd co-opted something that didn't belong to them. And this was, like years ago, this is before the whole like woke debate. So there wasn't as much backlash over this. There was just like this was like sort of a flub, and this wasn't like not a great situation. And everyone would sort of make the same joke, which is like you could tell there wasn't a gay person in the room when they made this. Everyone has their laugh, and the speaker sort of goes like, but like really, seriously, if we find queer talent and we put them in the room and we empower them and we make sure that they have equity, then like the work will fix itself, which is like a very important conversation. No matter where I worked, and I've worked at, agencies with various degrees of like commitment to the space and different cultures, I would get back. I'm all inspired by this conversation. I've seen other people come back from similar conferences and panels, and they come back and they sort of go, like, are we in the room? Like, we gotta do something about this. And things, but the momentum doesn't stay. There's, it's like, well, glad you went to a conference and you got all inspired. Anyways, we were back here doing the work on the client, and you have to jump back into that. Also,
Mhm.
that Pride is coming up in 6 months, so you'll have your chance then. The momentum just sort of dissipates, and also the assumption that the queer person in the room sort of like pervades. The fact is that we don't know if there's an LGBTQ person in the room. We are in the nomenclature of Oprah. We don't know if they were silent or silenced. We don't know if they are just
Right.
choosing not to share themselves. We don't know if they feel like they're endangered if they do. We don't know, by the way. And I think that what everyone is imagining is we put forth our ideas, and the team is just like, we got to like kill that. That's not good. We don't talk about that stuff here. But the fact is, like, I mean, some brand teams are probably, or some agency teams are probably pretty supportive, but maybe the brief didn't lend itself to giving the idea. Or maybe everyone was sort of on board, but they didn't have the data that they needed to substantiate doing a campaign that like sort of took this pivot, so then they couldn't move forward. Or there's a very like queer idea that gets lost in production because it was staffed by like, the team that we always go to, which is a bunch of, cis straight white guys. And that's our director and that's our producer. So like how could they possibly capture the nuance of this? So our mission is to understand the dynamics of this. We are also I think, it helps people to know 3% and ad color to understand our role. Do look up those organizations if you don't know them. It's also good for
Mhm.
people to know GLAD. And I think that GLAD is, something where you and I doing the work we do think it's probably pretty ubiquitous, but I encounter people who don't know it very well. And they monitor what makes it to the screen. So they say if
Mm,
7.2% of people in the nation are currently identifying as LGBTQ, good news. This year in movies, 9% of the characters were LGBTQ. Wow, that's great progress, right? Especially with where the demographics are going. But bad news, like 80% of those characters were white, and like none of them were representing like, asexual people. And so they show what happens, what makes it to the screen, but we are all about like, what is the process to getting there? So
yeah.
we explore that through conversations, through data, through partnerships. For us, it's all about like, the core of how is our queerness being leveraged as an advantage for businesses, and how are we embedded into them, and how are we being asked for inputs, how are we actively providing inputs. If you love the creative process of this industry and like that's sort of a fascination for you, like it should be fun to play with us and figure out where we fit in the big puzzle.
Yeah, I love that so much. And I think this is why I keep continuing to be drawn to conversations with you and partnering with Do the Work. Because at the core of the work that you do, it is really around inclusion and equity. It's about process, it's about representation, it's about authentic ways of representing queer in media or advertising, while also supporting the individuals within the workforce too. I think another organization to think about in the same space is Asians in advertising. Certainly not of of the scale of AdColor and 3%, but similarly champion Asians in advertising in similar ways. Just as a throwing another organization out there. I think one conversation and some of the work that we have done together is thinking about the role and the importance of ERGs and LGBTQIA ERGs. Do you want to share a little bit about what was the inspiration behind the study that we did together and some of the key learnings?
Yeah, so back in the early days of Do the Work, so I meet Kate, and it's like I said, it's around 2000. I, by the way, meet her by phone because it's COVID, and we end up like starting Do the Work as an LLC and owning a business together. And she was the person I talked to more than anyone, and I didn't get to meet her for a year. It was crazy. Um, so early days where there were a lot of around the time of the George Floyd tragedy and the response from our industry and many other industries, there was a lot of like, we need to, so now we know we need to institute this practice, we need to meet this standard. And there were a lot of like DEI sort of movements at the time that were just sort of saying like, this is the pledge you sign, and things like that. And so that's immediately where I went. And Kate went to a place of like, we can't do that yet. We don't know anything.
Mm,
It's only been a couple years that we have been a federally protected class from an employment standpoint. So like even let's say the most, you know, liberal, woke, benign employer wants to sort of like come to their people and say, like, look, we're just trying to find out how many LGBTQ people are here at the company so we could start to support you more and start to figure out what your needs are. And it's an anonymous survey. People would still be really reticent to fill something out where they're just like, there can be zero paper trail back to me as a queer person, because if they want to fire me for that reason, or discriminate against me for that reason, they're allowed to currently, right? So we're in this place where, currently at least we are in a more protected place. And so we can start asking those questions. The questions that we have to ask are, we have the area where we have the most insights currently is how people feel about how the general public feels about LGBTQ people in advertising. And a lot of that focus over the past few years has gone to a very important place, the money. So we had like a lot of information about the money, but that doesn't necessarily lend itself to like agency policy, right? What they should do. They should just know that the opportunity is out there, right? So that's those studies are all very important. And then we have done a series of studies with Disco, which they've been amazing partners, and we've done four studies over 40 years, like almost the full length of our existence, where they jumped in and they provided us with Gen Pop information about how people feel about queer inclusion in advertising, how that changes based on the political landscape, which, by the way, like, we shouldn't bring our political bias into this, but like we should understand that politics are a major force in this country right now, and we can't ignore them in terms of how people are making consumer decisions, right? So we've researched those things. We eventually want more information on what it's like to work in the industry. So we want to find out what the world thinks about us. Then we want to find out what we think about ourselves. But in the meantime, as I mentioned, like a lot of the early work was coming from these employee resource groups. If you're not familiar with those, there are three sort of tiers of them. There are Affinity groups, I actually sort of mapped out a simple way to explain this. So affinity groups, which are what they were called for a long time, I think predominantly are sanctioned. I think that these are groups of you can. So you can meet with other LGBTQ people in the office or other Asian people or other parents. And you can meet and sort of figure out like what how you want to connect and what sort of differences you want to make in the world and figure out whether there's anything you want to do together. ERGs, employee resource groups, are supported. So affinity groups are sanctioned, ERGs are supported. ERGs are more a you should. So they're supported, there's some funding, there's things you can do. You could do a pride thing, you could do a campaign thing. You should do something once you're together, but the agency doesn't necessarily dictate what that is, or the company doesn't sort of say like, this is what we expect from you. And what we saw in our research is that very little of what any of these groups do is measured. So it was like, you should do something. BRGs, business resource groups, are embedded and they are a you will kind of function. So they have been built into the product and process of the company. They are getting executive input. They are the most, I think, ironclad organizations for the struggles ahead, where lobbyists are coming to companies and saying, like, all this DEI stuff, what is it getting you? And I think BRGs are the ones that will have said, well, we know what it's getting us. We had objectives. We're embedded into the product. We influence the creative process. You have, your skepticism has no place here because we are embedded in the business. And knowing that those organizations were so vital. By the way, they're always thrown out as the defense. So it's like, you don't stand up for queer people. We've got our gay group, so you don't got us. And it's like, yeah, but like, what are these groups? How old are they? What sort of support do they receive? They are almost all inventing themselves with some marginal amount of leadership support. So we wanted to figure out what ERGs were, if they're going to be held up as the number one, like, sign of we're actually in it. It's like, okay, well, what is the structure and what are they across the industry? Knowing that the four A's unites agencies and provides them resources like no other. We wanted to pair with you on figuring out how the agencies within your network, who are some of the most established and innovative, were coming forth with these organizations and what sort of function they were serving.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a perfect way to describe the difference in organization types, let's call them, or RG types within an organization. And I think a very significant difference for BRGs is they often have an executive level sponsor. And that is so critical to the inclusion, if you will, into the rest of the organization from a performance standpoint, operations, process, metrics, policy, et cetera. And that is a very big difference from an ERG, which is typically employee led as well. And I think
Yes.
there's probably a subsequent conversation that we can get into about all of the different functions, but that's also some of the things that we learned in terms of what the LGBTQIA ERGs wanted, needed out of this study.
Yes. Um, and figuring out what they need so we could better serve them. Again, this goes back to like what was the mission? And I'm like, we should have a benchmark. And Kate's like, we can't do that. So one of the things I love so much about the survey, which I understand is, the first ever look into what LGBTQIA ERGs
It's a
are.
mouthful, but a very important mouthful.
It is, yeah. And also, like, everyone needs to understand that I had tension headaches last year that meant I had to cut caffeine out of my diet in the morning. So I'm just trying to spit all these words out and these acronyms out without caffeine. Voila. Yeah, the whole aim of this is again to sort of figure out what the structure of these was and what the function of them was so we could start to figure out how to serve them. We have a number of data streams in development that are going to allow us to make better decisions based on what the people say they want. This is an industry that always says that they are, dictated by data and that they embrace data. So we dove in and asked a pretty substantial questionnaire to any group that felt comfortable responding to it. The responses were from the leaders representing the LGBTQ groups. And, we got some interesting stats back. This is the most ready that I will get during this discussion. But so 93% of ERGs, a vast majority, reported that at least moderate stakeholder support, and that they had moderate stakeholder support, and that but the backing was limited in scope and timing. 53% desired more active leadership in involvement beyond key periods like Pride Month. So right off the bat, data is really helpful if it either like blows your mind in terms of like, wow, I had no idea, or substantiates what you considered to be common sense before. So almost every think piece that I read about Pride in the, late teens was, and we've got to talk about this outside of June. And that's still sort of where the focus goes, right? We always love to talk about how we are gay in December. Surprise, surprise, not only gay in June, and this is a long-term commitment to people who exist with their orientation and identities, you know, uh, outside of one specific holiday, right? So,
Mhm.
so that was really telling. But then this is where we start to get into like the real where the need lies. So
Mhm.
there's an aspiration for greater impact and influence on the business. Less than a third had a formal mission statement aligned with their business goals, and only 15% were measured on their impact, which is messed up considering that what gets measured gets minded. This is troubling in light of the current landscape in terms of the ability of these functions to exist, but
Mhm.
also not incongruous or not inconsistent with the definition that we gave for the ERGs, which is you should, so it's like if you're, and if we can measure what you do, all the better, right? Many, 53%, so over half expressed a desire for a greater role in shaping agency policy. This is the most telling need to me in terms of what these are for. So again, we've got lobbyists going around, and they're sort of, they're getting some major brands to divest from all of these different functions. They're saying that what is all this getting you? You've done a bunch of talking, you've done a bunch of expenditures, all this stuff. What is the, profit margin for you specifically? Which this is where things get like really also an extra level of messed up, which is that we have so many studies, and I'm sure you've seen a ton of these, I've seen a ton of these that say if you have, I'm just like, if you have diversity in your leadership teams, profits go up this amount. Organizations with at least 30% women on their advisory boards have 10% more profit, things along those lines. We have so many studies for those. So everyone goes into this DEI stuff going like, okay, well, we know that like businesses that have these things have an advantage, but the ability for any individual business to prove the impact that it has had on them is very difficult. I don't think that a lot of people are like, okay, so we, and you don't want to, what we tell people as communities is like, don't make us a monolith, don't make us, don't put an emotional burden on us for like the burden of education for all this stuff. So it's like, we welcome multicultural people in, but then we have to be respectful of them. And that doesn't make it easy to make a thread between their impact on the company from a multicultural perspective to someone who's generating profit, right? It gets like very
Mhm.
private. So what do? We start to measure based on tactics. We start to go, well, okay, well, we can't say that like because we have all these LGBTQ people here, and by the way, am I allowed to say that? Like that's the phase we're still in, right? So those folks are here. How can we measure their impact on the business? Let's let them sort of do their thing. And they don't find ways to embed things into the structure. And that's why when skeptics, when lobbyists are coming to call in and they're saying, like, we don't know why you have these and you can't prove the profit, they're just like, you're right, we can't. So
Mhm.
we have to find the way to start measuring the impact of these groups. We have to start finding the concrete ways that they're tied to the creative process. The reason, I sort of say business resource groups are the you must or the, you will, is because, they should exist in the context of businesses because they are making a demonstrable contribution. So it's not just like, hey, it's not a you can, like you can have a pride parade, how nice for you. It's a like we are welcoming you say you want to bring your full self to work and that you want diverse perspective here. We will provide the format by which you will give us that perspective in a way that shapes this business. And I don't think most organizations are anywhere near that place. And I also think that like, and this is where I'm going to piss a few people off, and I'm more than happy to do so. This business constantly says we believe the data. The data is the most important thing. Like we're so data forward. Okay, cool. You have about 1,000 studies that say that like people want to decide on their own terms that whether or not they're remote work, and you've got a ton of studies that say that people who decide those things and have freedom around those things are are more productive, contribute more, they're happier, and then you've got a bunch of leaders who are like, yeah, but I know my culture. And I know that our people need to come in 5 days a week. So, like, let's not pretend that we always like adhere to the data. So, we have to get over ourselves and learn to start trusting the data when it's given to us by communities themselves. And then we have to learn how to figure out the data flow of tying multicultural groups to the bottom line of these companies so they can exist in 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so much jam packed in what you said. But one thing I heard very loud and clear is the importance of shifting ERGs towards being BRGs. You didn't say it exactly that way, but of all the things that you said, it all tied to that in terms of integration into the business. It's very difficult, though, given resources, given commitments, given et cetera, et cetera. What are, from your perspective, and based on the research that we also learned from, a couple of key things that our ERGs can start to adopt and integrate into being an ERG that will move them towards a BRG? What are some thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that we got some really clear direction. And by the way, I do want to acknowledge you're right. This is like very, very dense. And your takeaway there is actually it's really funny. So spoilers for the audience, some behind the scenes movie magic. You and I talked about some of these things a couple days ago. And when we did, it was funny. I went from there to a planning meeting with Do the Work, and this conversation helped me distill two things I think that the industry needs to know for the year ahead. And one of them is yes, I think you have to elevate your ERGs to BRGs. So I do want to like, yes, you are right on. That is the point we're trying to convey ultimately. The way to sort of advance and evolve these is to start tracking and measuring impact, providing resources to help ERGs establish clear measurement criteria and track their business and cultural impact on agencies is a very important thing. I am, and we discussed this a little bit the other day too. I'm a PR person and I have decades of experience helping people write awards entries. And the number of times where it's like, even if they had great stats on the back end, it's like, okay, really quick, by the way, they're also asking what you intended to do from the outset of the campaign so we can compare and benchmark. And they're just like, we're going to have to write that retroactively. We had an idea, there's so much tactical thinking in this business, right? So I think that like the number one thing we have to sort of figure out, and I think this is actually kind of like a fun, interesting part of this is like I love, imagining possibilities for culture. Like, it's just like what does it look like if we get it right? And again, there's like so much should dominating things. It's like, well,
Yeah.
this is a tangible thing. I know you mentioned limited resources and limited bandwidth for stuff. But like, we also have some of the best creative thinkers in terms of like what campaigns can accomplish. So start thinking about those things and then the pipelines for those. We as an industry, relative to all others, have a great advantage in terms of like figuring out what sort of like messaging and things we could do that will turn into behavioral change and what that should look like. I just helped judge for the second year in a row the Drum Social Purpose Awards. And it's just such a beautiful thing to see. You know, there's some great things that were accomplished and they didn't have goals from the outset. So it's just like, what was the purpose of this besides like PR and visibility? And then when you see it done right, you know that there was these great thinkers that know good business is the same as doing good. And like, let's just sort of like dimensionalize what the through line is between making those things happen. So there's that. We want to facilitate new networking opportunities. So there was an ask specifically for local in-person events. Do the like this research gave us our brief for how we're going to do our plan. So anyone who's going to be privy to that presentation is going to see we're following our own advice here. But like we want everyone doing the work. So provide more opportunities in your market. If you live in Nashville and you have never once seen a LGBTQ mixer for people in ad land and you have office space, it'll make it, you will be solving people's number one need, I believe, in the survey in terms of just like bringing people together so they can start to connect. So all of this, like, what can I do? It doesn't have to be more complicated than like bring people together. So that's
Mhm.
good. And bringing your ERGs together with other organizations. And then finally, collaborating for impact and inspiration is a big one. So collecting and sharing examples of ERG influence on creative work and agency policy. So one of my biggest sort of sources of admiration and like, oh shit, I can't believe you had to do that for ERGs is the ways in which it's like, in addition to doing your day job, you had to figure out as someone who's not trained necessarily in DEI, how to build this function, how to come up with like your employee policies, how to come up with your, creative pipeline and how you fit into it. You have to figure out all these things. Um, I love that. I believe it's Cornette that did. Again, it's early on a Friday. That did work as a drag, which was they
Mm.
developed a dress code that basically sort of said, "Look, inclusive dress code looks like this," and they illustrated that with a series of photos that was employees dressed in drag just doing work. It doesn't have to be, it's not a political statement. It's not a social agenda. It's just like you can wear whatever you want because this is an industry of self-expression. No other agency should be trying to figure out what the dress code is and doing this in pockets and sort of researching all this stuff. Someone kind of figured it out. So we always want to be like, we want to do the work to allow people to like all sort of like do the thing they do best, and then we're the centralized way through which that is all shared, right? We worked with you and the agencies that are in your network so that we can figure out amongst ourselves like what ERGs are and to share that for free with the world. And that's going to be a really important thing. I think if you are an agency that wants to shout from the rooftops that there's a part of this puzzle you got right, self-identification, simple pride parties that are actually like respectful to your employees and give them resources, budgeting for what an ERG looks like, they should be sharing those things with us so we can share them with the world. They can take credit for the innovation they did, and then everyone else doesn't have to invent those things from scratch.
That's awesome and very, very clear on how organizations and individuals can get involved with Do the Work, which is certainly one of the questions I wanted to ask. So, just in wrapping up, what are you optimistic about as you look ahead?
I took my notes. Okay, so I'm optimistic about just in a larger, like sort of like humanistic way. I'm a meditator. I swear I'm not that guy that tells everyone they should meditate for every reason, but I do Headspace. It teaches impermanence, which is a really nice way to sort of process the fact that, life is good and then it's bad and then it's good and then it's bad. And we're having a lot of conversations right now about how DEI is two steps forward and one step back. So we're seeing heavy resistance to certain communities. You know why we're seeing heavy resistance in certain communities is because they existed in mass enough to like, be out there and be represented in the media and in some of the content that we were doing, which makes other people upset. So it's like the fact that there's backlash means that like we exist and are visible in a way that we weren't before. So that's not the same problem that we had, you know, 10, 20 years ago, where there's a backlash to visibility. The problem was before we didn't have visibility. So the problems will change the same way that we're pivoting to meet them in new ways or to represent ourselves in new ways. Opposition will pivot in response to what we're doing. So it's a process, and we've made some progress, and we cannot deny that. So that's good. I also pull optimism from the fact that um, creativity is powerful. We're all in this industry because we know that's the case. And I just think that like LGBTQ communities have a advantage when it comes to creativity. When people think of queerness, and actually props to Ariel Agozi, who's a member of the court for Do the Work, the leadership team, and I'm sure she may have pulled this from somewhere else, but the way she phrased it in the conversation was that like, you know, it's very limited to see my gayness as like I'm into dudes. It's very, to see my gender identity in terms of I like to wear certain clothes. The fact is that we love on our terms. We love ourselves on our terms. We love ourselves. We love other people on our terms. We create chosen family. I'm about to have the gayest Thanksgiving with people who are just like, we get to decide what this is for ourselves. And, we're just tired of the old brief. We saw the old brief. It said you have to live a certain way, you have to be a certain way. And, everyone just sort of puts this into the opposition puts this into a bucket of like, you're not traditional. No, we're not. We thought outside of the brief, and we came up with our own traditions, and we came up with our own ways to love ourselves. That's the nature of creativity. If that's what we inherently have, and that's what people are rising up against is our creative power, I'm definitely concerned for the times ahead, but I'm not worried about overall our ability to rise up and meet it because we always have. And we're creative as hell. One of the things about Do the Work is like we took the word work, right? Like queer people of color took the word work and made it into work. And it's like we take everything and make it kind of fun and more interesting. So like I think that there's a lot of promise for us in that.
Thank you. I can think of no better way to end this conversation than that uplifting view. Thank you so much, Graham. I really loved the conversation. I've loved partnering with Do the Work, and I'm so looking forward to continuing our work together. Thank you for joining me today.
Likewise, and I just have to point out that this happens because you have a whole organization behind you, but it's more and more clear it starts with individuals, like your willingness to take the call, you're willing to bring in, Anne, who's like reading the press release, like everyone, you can't just rely on our organization believes in this. It's your personal involvement that makes a difference and everyone's. So we welcome more of that and thank you for embodying that.
Thank you so much.